Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the suffocating world of Victorian women's etiquette. The elaborate social prison that turned simply existing as a female human being into an Olympic sport with deadly consequences and absolutely no gold medals. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy watching me dissect historical absurdity. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what your current relationship status is with corsets. It's always fascinating to see who's brave enough to learn about humanity's past mistakes. Now, dim the lights, maybe brew some tea in the most socially acceptable manner possible, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you think you could survive as a Victorian lady? Precious. Truly, like a goldfish trying to navigate a diplomatic crisis while wearing 20 pounds of fabric and pretending not to have internal organs. Picture this, you're a woman in Victorian England, and you've just woken up thinking today might be a good day to exist as a human being. Wrong. Dead wrong. You're not a human being. You're a walking, breathing embodiment of moral purity, wrapped in enough fabric to upholster a small carriage. And every single movement you make is being judged by a society that has somehow managed to turn the simple act of breathing into a potential scandal. Welcome to Victorian womanhood, where the rules were made up by men who had never worn a corset, and the points absolutely mattered, because your entire social standing, marriage, and basic right to exist in polite society depended on whether you could navigate a social minefield that would make modern etiquette look like a casual suggestion. Let's start with the morning, because even waking up had rules. You couldn't just roll out of bed like some sort of barbarian. Oh no, a proper Victorian lady never appeared before others in her nightgown, not even her own family members. The sight of a woman in her sleeping attire was considered so scandalous that it could literally ruin her reputation. We're talking about ankle, length, high neck, long, sleeved cotton nightgowns that covered more skin than most modern winter coats. But apparently even that was too risque for Victorian sensibilities. The first challenge of your day, getting dressed. And when I say getting dressed, I don't mean throwing on some clothes. I mean participating in an elaborate ritual that would make a Japanese tea ceremony look like speed dressing. You couldn't dress yourself, obviously. That would be vulgar. A proper lady required assistance, preferably from a lady's maid, but if you were middle class and couldn't afford such luxuries, a female family member would have to suffice. Male assistance was absolutely out of the question, even from your own husband or father, because the mere suggestion that a man might help a woman with her clothing was enough to send the entire Victorian moral establishment into collective apoplexy. The process began with the chemise, a thin cotton undergarment that served as the foundation for everything else. Then came the corset, that instrument of torture disguised as foundation wear. But here's where it gets weird. You weren't allowed to lace it yourself. The act of a woman reaching behind her back and adjusting her own corset was considered unseemly, suggesting an improper familiarity with her own body. Victorian society had somehow managed to make women strangers to themselves, requiring them to rely on others for the most basic aspects of personal care. The corset itself was a marvel of engineering and oppression. It wasn't just about having a small waist, it was about having a waist so impossibly tiny that it defied human anatomy. We're talking about reducing a woman's natural waist by 6 to 8 inches, sometimes more. The pressure was so intense that it displaced internal organs, made breathing difficult, and occasionally caused fainting spells, which Victorian society found absolutely delightful because nothing said, "refined lady," quite like randomly losing consciousness due to fashion choices. But the corset was just the beginning. Over that went the bustle, a contraption designed to make a woman's posterior appear larger while simultaneously making it impossible for her to sit normally. The bustle wasn't just a small pad, it was an architectural achievement involving wire frames, horsehair padding, and enough structural engineering to build a small bridge. Some bustles were so large that women couldn't fit through doorways sideways and had to approach every entrance straight on, like a ship docking at port. Then came the layers. Oh, the layers. Chemise, corset, corset cover, drawers, stockings, petticoat, bustle, second petticoat, third petticoat if you were feeling fancy, and finally the dress itself. By the time a Victorian woman was fully dressed, she was wearing enough fabric to clothe a small village and enough metal framework to build a greenhouse. The total weight of a full Victorian outfit could easily reach 20 to 30 pounds, which meant that simply getting dressed was a daily workout routine. And speaking of workouts, exercise was another minefield of absurd rules. Victorian women weren't supposed to sweat, ever. The very idea of a woman perspiring was considered so vulgar that it could ruin her marriageability. This presented a bit of a problem when it came to physical activity, because the human body has this annoying tendency to produce sweat when exerted. The solution: women weren't supposed to exert themselves at all. If a Victorian woman wanted to engage in something resembling exercise, she had to do so in a way that maintained absolute propriety. Horseback riding was acceptable, but only side saddle, because straddling a horse was considered masculine and therefore inappropriate. This meant that women had to balance on a horse, using only one leg for support, while maintaining perfect posture and looking graceful, all while wearing a full-length riding habit that could easily get caught in the stirrups and drag them to their death. But hey, at least they looked proper while dying. Walking was encouraged, but only at a gentle pace, and only for short distances. Running was absolutely forbidden, unless you were being chased by a wild animal, and even then, you were expected to maintain your dignity while fleeing for your life. Competitive sports were out of the question because they involved too much movement, too much exertion, and far too much fun for a proper lady. Swimming presented its own unique challenges. Victorian society loved the idea of women taking healthful dips in the ocean, but they couldn't actually be seen in swimming attire because that would be scandalous. The solution was the bathing machine, a wheeled wooden hut that would be rolled into the water with the woman inside. She would change into her swimming costume, which consisted of enough fabric to clothe a small army, and then emerge directly into the water where no one could see her. The swimming costume itself was a masterpiece of impracticality, a full-length dress with sleeves, worn over bloomers with stockings and swimming shoes, all made of heavy wool that would absorb water and make swimming nearly impossible. The goal wasn't actually to swim. It was to stand in the water looking miserable while maintaining complete modesty. But perhaps nowhere were Victorian etiquette rules more bizarre than when it came to social interactions. A woman couldn't simply talk to people willy-nilly. Oh no, every conversation had to follow strict protocols that would make diplomatic negotiations look casual. First, there was the matter of introductions. A woman could not introduce herself to anyone ever. She had to wait to be introduced by a mutual acquaintance, and even then, she couldn't acknowledge the introduction unless she wanted to. A woman had the right to cut someone socially, which meant pretending they didn't exist even after being formally introduced. This led to incredibly awkward situations where two people who had been introduced would stand in the same room, fully aware of each other's presence, but pretending the other was invisible because one of them had decided not to acknowledge the introduction. The handshake was another minefield. Women weren't supposed to offer their hands first. They had to wait for the other person to extend theirs. But they also couldn't shake hands too firmly, because that would be masculine. And they couldn't shake too limply because that would be weak. They had to achieve the perfect balance of acknowledgement without enthusiasm, politeness without familiarity, and engagement without impropriety. Many women practiced their handshakes in private, trying to perfect the art of conveying exactly the right amount of interest, while maintaining appropriate distance. Conversation itself was regulated to an absurd degree. There were topics that were appropriate for mixed company, topics that were only appropriate for female company, and topics that were inappropriate for any company at all. Politics was generally off limits unless you were discussing it in the most superficial way possible. Religion was acceptable but only in the most general, non-controversial terms. Literature was encouraged, but only certain types of literature. Novels were suspect because they dealt with emotions and relationships, which were considered potentially corrupting influences. Weather was always a safe topic, which is why Victorian conversations were full of detailed discussions about cloud formations and barometric pressure. Everyone became amateur meteorologists out of social necessity. The state of the roads was another safe subject, leading to incredibly detailed conversations about mud consistency and carriage wheel maintenance. Victorian women probably knew more about road conditions than most modern GPS systems. But here's where it gets really weird. Victorian women weren't allowed to be too knowledgeable about anything. Intelligence was considered attractive up to a point, but beyond that point, it became threatening. A woman who knew too much about any subject was considered unwomanly and potentially dangerous to social order. This meant that Victorian women had to carefully calibrate their intelligence, showing just enough knowledge to be interesting, but not so much as to be intimidating. They had to be smart enough to hold a conversation, but not smart enough to win an argument. It was intellectual tightrope walking. The rules around men were particularly insane. An unmarried woman could not be alone with a man who wasn't a family member, ever, under any circumstances. This wasn't just about romantic situations, it applied to all male-female interactions. If a woman found herself alone with a man, even accidentally, it was considered compromising and could ruin her reputation. This led to elaborate chaperoning systems where women were constantly accompanied by other women or family members, like a perpetual buddy system for adults. Even married women faced restrictions. A married woman couldn't be alone with a man who wasn't her husband without raising eyebrows. Business meetings, professional consultations, casual conversations, all had to be conducted with witnesses present. Victorian society was so paranoid about male-female interactions that they essentially made it impossible for men and women to have normal human relationships. The calling card system was perhaps the most Byzantine aspect of Victorian social interaction. These weren't just business cards. They were complex communication tools with their own elaborate language. The way you folded a calling card conveyed different messages. A card folded in a certain way might indicate condolences, while another fold indicated congratulations. The corner that was turned down had meaning. The time of day the card was left had meaning. The day of the week had meaning. Victorian women had to become experts in calling card semiotics just to navigate basic social interactions. Receiving visitors was an art form in itself. A woman couldn't just open her door to anyone who knocked. She had to have official receiving hours, usually specified times during certain days of the week when she would be home to visitors. During these hours, she was expected to be perfectly dressed, perfectly coiffed, and perfectly prepared to entertain anyone who might call. But she also had to be prepared to not receive certain visitors, which required elaborate systems of communication between the lady of the house and her servants. The servant would answer the door and present the calling card to the lady, who would then decide whether she was home to that particular visitor. If she didn't want to see them, she was officially not at home, even though she was obviously at home. The servant would then inform the visitor that the lady was not at home. The visitor would leave their card, and everyone would pretend that this elaborate charade was completely normal. But what if you were visiting someone else? That had its own rules. You couldn't just show up and expect to be received. You had to leave your card first, indicating your intention to call. Then you had to wait to see if your card was returned, which would indicate whether you were welcome to visit. If your card was returned with a corner folded, it might mean the lady was not receiving visitors that week. If it was returned with writing on it, that was another message entirely. The whole system was like a complex board game where the rules were constantly changing and the penalties for mistakes were social death. Tea time was another minefield of protocol. You might think that drinking tea is a simple activity: hot water, tea leaves, maybe some sugar, but Victorian society managed to turn it into a performance art piece requiring years of training to master. The proper way to hold a teacup pinky down, not up, contrary to popular belief. The correct stirring technique, back and forth, not circular. The appropriate number of sugar lumps, never more than 2, and only if absolutely necessary, because refined palates didn't require sweetening. The proper way to place the spoon, never left in the cup, and the correct positioning of the saucer, always held, never left on the table, were all matters of crucial importance. But tea etiquette went far beyond the mechanics of drinking. The hostess had to know exactly how each guest preferred their tea, and she was expected to remember these preferences from visit to visit. Mrs. Henderson takes 1 sugar, no milk. Lady Pemberton prefers milk but no sugar. Miss Williams likes her tea weak with both milk and sugar. Keeping track of everyone's tea preferences was like managing a complex database of beverage requirements. The food served with tea was subject to equally rigid rules. Certain types of sandwiches were appropriate for certain times of day. Cucumber sandwiches were for afternoon tea, but never for morning calls. Sweet cakes were acceptable, but only certain types, and they had to be eaten in a specific order. You started with savoury items, then moved to sweet, but you couldn't skip around or go back. Victorian tea time was like a predetermined progression through carefully orchestrated flavour profiles. And speaking of food, dining etiquette was a minefield that could destroy reputations faster than a gossip columnist with a deadline. Victorian dinner parties weren't just social events. They were elaborate theatrical productions with more rules than a medieval tournament. The seating arrangements alone required advanced degrees in diplomacy and genealogy. Who sat where was determined by a complex hierarchy involving social rank, age, marital status, and recent scandals. The hostess had to know not just the social ranking of every guest, but also their current relationships with every other guest. Lord Pemberton couldn't sit next to Colonel Williams because they had a disagreement about hunting rights in 1847. Lady Henderson wouldn't speak to Mrs. Thompson because of some ancient slight involving a hat at a garden party. Miss Davidson had to be kept away from the young gentleman because her reputation was slightly tarnished after she was seen laughing too loudly at a previous dinner party. Place cards weren't just helpful guides, they were carefully calculated political statements. Moving someone's place card was considered an act of war. Arriving late enough that you disrupted the seating arrangement was social suicide. The hostess would spend days, sometimes weeks, working out seating charts like a general planning a military campaign. Once seated, the dining began, and with it, a ballot of propriety that would make professional dancers weep. Every course had its own utensils, and using the wrong fork for the wrong course was like wearing a sign that said, "I don't belong here." There were forks for fish, forks for meat, forks for salad, forks for dessert, and specialized forks for things you didn't even know needed their own forks. The table setting looked like a surgical instrument display, and women were expected to navigate through it with the precision of a skilled surgeon. But it wasn't just about using the right utensils. It was about using them in the right way. Your fork had to be held at the correct angle. Your knife had to be positioned properly when not in use. You couldn't cut more than 1 bite at a time, and you certainly couldn't cut up your entire portion at once like some sort of barbarian. Each bite had to be individually prepared, as if you were performing surgery rather than eating dinner. Conversation during meals was regulated to the point of absurdity. You were supposed to talk to the person on your right during certain courses, and the person on your left during others. You couldn't monopolize one conversation partner for the entire meal, but you also couldn't ignore anyone. You had to be engaging but not too entertaining, interesting but not controversial, knowledgeable but not pedantic. It was like being a professional entertainer, diplomat, and scholar all at the same time, while also trying to eat a 7-course meal without spilling anything on your dress. Speaking of spills, any dining accident was considered a minor catastrophe. Knocking over a wine glass wasn't just clumsy, it was a social failure that would be remembered and discussed for weeks. Women developed the ability to eat entire meals while barely moving, as if they were trying to avoid setting off motion sensors. They learned to take tiny bites, chew almost imperceptibly, and swallow without making any sound whatsoever. The rules around alcohol were particularly bizarre. Women were allowed to drink wine with dinner, but only certain types and only in small amounts. They couldn't appear to enjoy it too much, because enthusiasm for alcohol was considered unladylike. They had to sip delicately, never drain their glass, and certainly never ask for more. But they also couldn't refuse alcohol entirely, because that would suggest they had a problem with drinking, which was somehow worse than actually having a problem with drinking. After dinner, the real fun began with the separation of the sexes. The men would retire to the smoking room for cigars and brandy, while the women would gather in the drawing room for, well, for sitting quietly and discussing topics deemed appropriate for female conversation. This separation wasn't just traditional, it was mandatory. Men and women couldn't remain together after dinner, because apparently the combination of food and mixed company was too dangerous for Victorian society to handle. In the drawing room, women would engage in activities that were considered suitably feminine: needlework, watercolor painting, playing the piano, or singing. But even these activities were regulated. You couldn't be too good at piano, because that would suggest you had spent too much time practicing, which implied you didn't have enough other responsibilities. You couldn't be too bad either, because musical accomplishments were expected of proper ladies. You had to hit the sweet spot of being competent, but not professional, talented, but not devoted. The same applied to other accomplishments. A woman should speak French, but not too fluently, because that would suggest foreign influence. She should be able to paint, but only watercolors, because oil painting was too messy and therefore unsuitable for ladies. She should be well read, but only in approved literature, and she certainly shouldn't write anything herself beyond, perhaps poetry in private journals that no one would ever see. Photography was a particular challenge when it was invented. Victorian society loved the idea of capturing family memories, but the process of photography was considered somewhat improper for women. Standing still for the long exposure times required for early photography was acceptable, but operating the camera equipment was considered too technical and therefore masculine. Women could pose for photographs but couldn't take them, leading to the odd situation where they were allowed to be art, but not create it. The rules around mourning were perhaps the most elaborate and bizarre of all Victorian etiquette requirements. When someone died, particularly a husband, a woman entered into a period of mourning that was more like joining a religious order than grieving a loss. The mourning period for a husband was 2 years, during which the widow had to follow rules so specific they made regular etiquette look casual. First, there was the mourning dress, which was black from head to toe with no exceptions. Not dark blue, not dark grey, but deep, unrelieved black. The fabric had to be completely matte. Anything with even the slightest sheen was considered inappropriate. Jewellery was forbidden except for mourning jewellery made from jet or the hair of the deceased. Yes, you read that correctly. Victorian mourning jewellery was often made from human hair, woven into intricate patterns and worn as brooches, bracelets, or lockets. Nothing says, "I miss you," quite like wearing your dead husband's hair as accessories. The mourning dress itself was a marvel of restrictive design. It covered every inch of skin except the face and hands, with long sleeves that buttoned tightly at the wrists, high necklines that reached the chin, and skirts that trailed on the ground to ensure that even the feet were hidden. The fabric was usually crepe, a material so stiff and uncomfortable that wearing it was a constant reminder of your loss, as if grief weren't sufficiently miserable on its own. But clothing was just the beginning. A mourning woman couldn't attend social events, couldn't participate in entertainment, couldn't listen to music, and couldn't engage in any activity that might be considered enjoyable. She was essentially supposed to become a living ghost, existing but not participating in life. The first year was called deep mourning, during which she couldn't leave the house except for church and essential errands. The second year was half mourning, during which she could venture out more but still couldn't engage in social activities. After the 2-year mourning period for a husband, there were different mourning periods for other family members. Parents required 1 year of mourning, siblings 6 months, grandparents 3 months. The periods were calculated precisely, and ending mourning too early was considered disrespectful to the deceased and scandalous to society. Victorian women became experts in mourning mathematics, calculating exactly when they would be allowed to resume normal life. But even after the official mourning period ended, there were rules about how to return to society. A woman couldn't simply show up at a party wearing a bright dress and expect to be welcomed back. She had to gradually transition from mourning dress to half, mourning dress to colours, and she had to gauge society's readiness to accept her return to normal life. Some women found the process so daunting that they simply remained in mourning indefinitely, becoming professional widows who wore black for the rest of their lives. The rules around children added another layer of complexity to Victorian women's lives. Motherhood was considered the highest calling for women, but it had to be performed according to strict guidelines that often contradicted natural maternal instincts. Mothers weren't supposed to be too affectionate with their children in public, because excessive displays of maternal love were considered unseemly. They couldn't discipline their children too harshly, because that would be unfeminine. But they also couldn't be too lenient, because that would be ineffective. Breastfeeding, a natural biological function, was considered so scandalous that it couldn't be discussed in polite company. Wealthy women were expected to hire wet nurses rather than feed their own children, because the act of breastfeeding was considered too animalistic for proper ladies. This led to the bizarre situation where the most natural aspect of motherhood was outsourced to working-class women who were considered more suitable for such base activities. Taking children out in public required its own set of protocols. Children had to be perfectly behaved at all times, reflecting their mother's training and discipline. A child who misbehaved in public was seen as evidence of maternal failure, which could damage a woman's social standing. Victorian mothers lived in constant fear of their children embarrassing them, leading to incredibly strict child rearing practices designed to produce miniature adults, rather than actual children. The nursery was typically located on the upper floors of the house, as far from the main living areas as possible, because children's noise and activities were considered disruptive to proper household management. Children were brought down to see their parents at appointed times, like scheduled meetings, and then returned to their separate world upstairs. The idea of family time as we understand it didn't exist. Instead, there were formal interactions between parents and children that followed as many rules as any other social engagement. Education for girls was another area where Victorian society managed to be both progressive and regressive simultaneously. Girls were expected to be educated, but only to a certain level and only in certain subjects. They should know enough to be interesting conversationalists, but not so much as to be intimidating to potential husbands. They should be familiar with literature, but not with anything too controversial or passionate. They should understand music and art, but not aspire to professional careers in these fields. Languages were encouraged, particularly French, because it was considered cultured, but not German, which was considered too academic, and certainly not Latin or Greek, which were masculine subjects. Mathematics was generally avoided because it was considered too logical and therefore unsuitable for the female mind, which was supposed to be governed by emotion and intuition rather than reason and calculation. The governess system created its own social complications. A governess occupied a strange position in the household hierarchy, too educated to be a servant, but not family either. She was supposed to educate the children while remaining invisible to adult society, teach proper behavior while having no social standing herself, and maintain authority over children whose parents outranked her socially. Victorian governesses were like social ghosts, essential but ignored, educated but powerless. Employment options for women were severely limited and came with their own etiquette challenges. Teaching was considered acceptable, but only for unmarried women, and only until they found husbands. Marriage meant immediate retirement from any profession, because working wives were considered a reflection of their husband's inability to provide adequate support. The idea that a woman might work because she enjoyed it or found it fulfilling was completely foreign to Victorian thinking. Writing was a profession that some women managed to enter, but even that came with restrictions. Female authors often published under male pseudonyms to avoid the scandal of being professional women. Those who published under their own names had to be very careful about their subject matter and their public behavior. A female author had to be more respectable than other women, not less, because her public visibility made her a target for social criticism. The rules around money were particularly bizarre. Women weren't supposed to understand finances too well, because money management was considered a masculine skill, but they were expected to manage household budgets efficiently without appearing to think about money too much. They had to be economical without being cheap, generous without being wasteful, and financially responsible without being financially knowledgeable. Shopping was one of the few activities where women had some freedom, but even that was regulated. A woman couldn't shop alone, she needed to be accompanied by a servant, family member, or friend. She couldn't handle money directly. Payment was typically arranged through accounts or handled by male family members. She couldn't bargain or negotiate prices, because that would be unseemly, even though household economy was supposed to be her responsibility. The concept of personal space was completely different for Victorian women. They were never truly alone and never truly private. Their bedrooms were shared with servants who dressed them. Their daily activities were observed by chaperones. Their conversations were monitored for propriety, and their behavior was constantly evaluated by society. Privacy, as we understand, it simply didn't exist for women of the Victorian era. Letter writing was one of the few areas where women could exercise some personal expression, but even that was subject to rules. Letters had to be written on appropriate paper, with appropriate ink, using appropriate language. The handwriting had to be elegant, but not too distinctive, because overly stylized handwriting suggested vanity. The content had to be interesting but not controversial, personal but not intimate, lengthy but not rambling. Love letters were particularly complicated. Unmarried women couldn't write love letters at all, because any written expression of romantic feeling was considered improper. Engaged women could write to their fiancés, but the letters had to be circumspect and could be read by chaperones. Married women could write more freely to their husbands, but even then, excessive passion was considered inappropriate. Travel presented its own challenges for Victorian women. They couldn't travel alone ever, under any circumstances. Even short journeys required male escorts or female companions. Long-distance travel required elaborate planning to ensure proper chaperoning at every stage of the journey. Women travelling by train had to book ladies-only compartments. Women travelling by ship had to have separate quarters, and women travelling by carriage had to be accompanied at all times. The concept of a vacation, as we understand, it didn't really exist for Victorian women. What we would call vacations were typically visits to relatives or trips to take the waters at spa towns, both of which involved as much social protocol as staying home. There was no such thing as relaxing or letting down one's guard. Propriety had to be maintained at all times, in all places, under all circumstances. Illness presented particular challenges because Victorian women were supposed to be delicate and prone to various ailments. But they also couldn't discuss their health in any detail because bodily functions were considered inappropriate topics of conversation. Women were expected to suffer silently and gracefully, never complaining too much, but also never appearing too robust, because excessive health was considered unfeminine. The treatment of female ailments was often more about maintaining propriety than providing effective medical care. Doctors couldn't examine female patients directly. They had to work through layers of clothing and rely on symptoms described by the patient or her female relatives. This led to incredibly ineffective medical treatment, but at least everyone's modesty was preserved. Mental health was even more problematic. Victorian society recognized that women suffered from various nervous disorders, but the treatments were often worse than the conditions. Women who showed signs of depression, anxiety, or any behavior that deviated from accepted norms could be diagnosed with hysteria and subjected to treatments that ranged from ineffective to harmful. The rest cure, which involved complete bed rest and isolation from all mental stimulation, was a popular treatment that probably made most conditions worse rather than better. The concept of female sexuality was so completely repressed that Victorian society managed to pretend it didn't exist at all. Women were supposed to be pure, innocent, and completely ignorant of anything related to physical intimacy until marriage, and even then, they were expected to be passive participants rather than active partners. Sex education for women consisted mainly of being told to lie still and think of England, which was probably not very helpful, but was considered appropriate preparation for married life. Pregnancy was another taboo subject. Pregnant women were expected to withdraw from society during the later stages of their pregnancies because their condition was considered too indelicate for public view. They couldn't discuss their pregnancies, couldn't prepare openly for childbirth, and certainly couldn't acknowledge the physical realities of carrying a child. Victorian society managed to treat pregnancy like a shameful secret rather than a natural biological process. Childbirth itself was shrouded in mystery and secrecy. Women were expected to suffer through labor without making too much noise because loud expressions of pain were considered unladylike. Pain relief was often avoided because suffering in childbirth was considered natural and proper for women. The high rates of maternal mortality were accepted as inevitable rather than addressed through better medical care. The rules around aging were particularly cruel for Victorian women. While men were allowed to grow distinguished as they aged, women were expected to remain youthful in appearance for as long as possible and then gracefully fade into invisibility. Older women who tried to maintain fashionable appearances were ridiculed as mutton dressed as lamb, but older women who let themselves go were dismissed as having given up on life. Cosmetics were available, but had to be used so subtly that they appeared natural. A woman who was obviously wearing makeup was considered vulgar and artificial. The goal was to enhance natural beauty, while appearing to wear no enhancement at all, which required considerable skill and high-quality products. Most Victorian women spent significant time and effort on their appearance, while pretending that beauty came naturally and effortlessly. Hair care was an elaborate ritual involving multiple steps and products. Women were expected to have lustrous, well-styled hair, but they couldn't appear to spend too much time on it. Hair had to be worn up in public after marriage, but the style couldn't be too elaborate or fashionable, because that would suggest vanity. The goal was to achieve perfect hair that looked effortless, which required considerable effort and skill. Jewelry had its own rules and regulations. Married women could wear more elaborate jewelry than unmarried women, but it couldn't be too flashy because that would be vulgar. Diamonds were for evening wear, pearls were for day wear, and colored gems were for specific occasions. Women had to know not just what jewelry to wear, but when and where to wear it, and how much was appropriate for their social position. The rules around servants were particularly complex because Victorian households typically employed multiple servants, and managing them required diplomatic skills that would be impressive in international relations. The mistress of the house had to maintain authority over her servants while remaining ladylike, had to give orders without appearing dictatorial, and had to manage household affairs without getting too involved in the actual work. Servants were expected to be invisible when not needed, but immediately available when summoned. The bell system in Victorian houses was an elaborate communication network that allowed family members to summon specific servants to specific locations without having to raise their voices or leave their rooms. Managing this system required organizational skills and timing that would challenge modern project managers. The annual hiring and firing of servants was a major undertaking that required careful consideration of references, character assessments, and household needs. A mistress had to know not just what work needed to be done, but who could do it properly, how much to pay them, and how to maintain discipline without being too harsh. The reputation of the household depended on the behavior of the servants, so hiring decisions were crucial to social standing. Charitable work was one of the few areas where Victorian women could exercise some independence and leadership, but even charity had its rules and regulations. Women were expected to be charitable, but not too charitable, and certainly not in ways that challenged existing social structures. They could help the deserving poor, but not question why poverty existed. They could provide aid to the sick, but not advocate for better medical care. They could support orphans, but not criticize the social conditions that created orphans. The type of charity work was important too. Visiting the poor was acceptable, but working directly with them was not. Organizing charity events was appropriate, but handling money was questionable. Writing about social problems was possible, but advocating for political solutions was inappropriate. Victorian women had to find ways to help others while staying within the narrow boundaries of acceptable female behavior. Religious observance was mandatory for respectable Victorian women, but even religion came with social complications. Women were expected to be more religious than men, but not so religious that they became fanatical. They should attend church regularly, but not be too enthusiastic about it. They should know their Bible, but not presume to interpret it. They should be moral examples, but not preachy about it. The choice of church was important, because different denominations had different social implications. The Church of England was most acceptable for the upper classes, while Methodism or other nonconformist religions were associated with the middle and working classes. Catholic women faced particular challenges because Catholicism was viewed with suspicion by much of Victorian society. Sunday observance was particularly strict for Victorian women. They couldn't engage in any activities that might be considered work or entertainment on Sundays. This meant no sewing, no letter writing, no music except hymns, no books except religious texts, and certainly no games or other recreational activities. Sunday was supposed to be devoted entirely to religious contemplation and family togetherness, which sounds nice in theory, but was often incredibly boring in practice. The rules around death and dying were extensive and complicated. Women were expected to be the primary caregivers for sick and dying family members, but they also had to maintain propriety while dealing with the realities of illness and death. They couldn't discuss medical details, couldn't acknowledge the physical aspects of dying, and had to provide comfort while remaining composed and dignified. Funeral arrangements were typically handled by male family members, but women were responsible for the social aspects of mourning. They had to notify appropriate people, arrange for condolence visits, manage the household during the mourning period, and ensure that all mourning protocols were followed correctly. A funeral that didn't meet social expectations could damage the family's reputation for generations. The Victorian emphasis on propriety extended even to accidents and emergencies. Women who found themselves in unusual or dangerous situations still had to maintain appropriate behaviour. There are accounts of Victorian women drowning because they wouldn't allow male rescuers to touch them, and of women suffering injuries because they couldn't seek appropriate medical attention without compromising their modesty. Natural disasters, fires, accidents, and other emergencies didn't excuse improper behaviour. Victorian women were expected to maintain their dignity even while fleeing burning buildings or surviving shipwrecks. The idea that survival might take precedence over propriety was foreign to Victorian thinking. The psychological toll of living under such constant scrutiny and regulation was enormous. But Victorian society didn't acknowledge mental health as we understand it today. Women who couldn't cope with the pressure were often labelled as having weak constitutions or nervous dispositions, and the treatments typically involved even more restrictions and isolation, rather than addressing the underlying causes of distress. The few women who managed to challenge Victorian expectations faced enormous social pressure and personal costs. Those who pursued careers, advocated for women's rights, or lived unconventional lives were often ostracised by society, criticised in the press, and labelled as unwomanly or unnatural. The price of independence was often complete social isolation. Even small acts of rebellion could have major consequences. A woman who spoke too freely, laughed too loudly, walked too quickly, or showed too much interest in inappropriate subjects could find herself the subject of gossip that would follow her for years. Victorian society had an incredibly long memory for social transgressions, and redemption was rarely possible once a woman's reputation was damaged. The irony of Victorian etiquette was that it claimed to protect and honour women, while actually imprisoning them in a system of rules so complex and restrictive that it made normal human behaviour nearly impossible. Women were placed on pedestals so high that they couldn't actually live on them, then criticised for failing to meet impossible standards. The daily reality of being a Victorian woman meant waking up each morning and putting on not just clothes, but an entire identity that had been designed by others and approved by society. Every gesture, every word, every expression had to be carefully considered and perfectly executed. It was like living in a perpetual performance where the audience was always watching, always judging, and never applauding. The physical discomfort was matched by the psychological strain of constant self-monitoring. Victorian women had to develop an internal critic more harsh and demanding than any external judge because the consequences of mistakes were so severe. They learned to second-guess every impulse, question every thought, and suppress every natural reaction that didn't conform to expectations. The rules around personal hygiene were another area where Victorian society managed to make the simple complicated. Women were expected to be clean and fresh, smelling. But they couldn't be too obvious about their cleanliness routines, because that would acknowledge the body's natural functions. Bathing was necessary, but had to be done in private with minimal assistance, and certainly couldn't be enjoyed. The goal was to achieve perfect cleanliness while pretending that bodies didn't require maintenance. Menstruation was perhaps the ultimate taboo subject. Victorian society managed to completely ignore a biological function that affected half the population monthly throughout their reproductive years. Women had to manage their menstrual periods while pretending they weren't happening, maintain their normal activities while dealing with physical discomfort, and never, ever acknowledge that this natural process existed. The silence around menstruation meant that young women often had no preparation for their first periods and no support for managing them. The lack of practical information about women's health extended to all aspects of female biology. Women were kept ignorant about their own bodies, then blamed when that ignorance led to problems. They were told that thinking too much about physical functions was unwomanly, but they were also expected to maintain perfect health through willpower and moral purity. Exercise, as we've mentioned, was problematic, but the lack of exercise created its own health issues. Victorian women often suffered from weak muscles, poor circulation, and various ailments related to their sedentary lifestyles. But the solution, more physical activity, was considered inappropriate. So women were trapped in a cycle of poor health caused by the very restrictions that were supposed to protect them. The corset, that symbol of Victorian femininity, was a health disaster disguised as fashion. Long-term corset wearing caused permanent changes to the ribcage, displaced internal organs, weakened back muscles, and contributed to a host of health problems. But Victorian society valued the appearance of a tiny waist more than the health of the women who achieved it through artificial means. Fainting was considered a sign of delicacy and refinement in Victorian women, which tells you everything you need to know about their health priorities. A woman who never fainted was considered too robust and potentially unfeminine. This led to the bizarre situation where poor health was more socially desirable than good health, and women sometimes faked fainting spells to appear more delicate and ladylike. The Victorian obsession with female purity extended beyond sexual matters to encompass all aspects of women's lives. Women were supposed to be pure in thought, pure in deed, pure in speech, and pure in appearance. This created impossible standards because human beings are naturally complex creatures with mixed motives, complicated thoughts, and imperfect behavior. Victorian women had to pretend to be angels when they were actually human beings. The concept of female anger was particularly problematic for Victorian society. Women were allowed to feel gentle disappointment or quiet sadness, but anger was considered masculine and therefore inappropriate. This meant that Victorian women had to find ways to deal with legitimate grievances and frustrations without expressing them directly. Many developed elaborate passive, aggressive strategies or suffered in silence rather than acknowledge their anger openly. The economic dependence of Victorian women was both a cause and a consequence of their social restrictions. Women who couldn't support themselves financially had to rely on male relatives or husbands for survival, which made challenging the system extremely dangerous. The few economic opportunities available to women typically disappeared upon marriage, ensuring that most women remained economically dependent throughout their lives. This economic dependence meant that marriage wasn't just a personal relationship for Victorian women, it was an economic necessity. The pressure to marry well was enormous because a woman's entire future depended on her choice of husband. But the courtship process was so regulated that women had little opportunity to actually get to know potential spouses before making this life-altering decision. The Victorian marriage market was exactly that, a market where women's value was determined by their appearance, accomplishments, family connections, and dowries. Women had to present themselves as desirable commodities while pretending that they weren't actively seeking husbands. The whole system was based on pretense and performance rather than genuine compatibility or mutual affection. Once married, Victorian women discovered that the restrictions didn't end, they just changed form. Married women had different rules, but not necessarily fewer rules. They gained some social freedoms but lost others. They could attend more events but had less personal autonomy. They had more responsibility but less independence. Marriage was supposed to be the goal of every Victorian woman's life, but it often proved to be just another form of social prison with different bars on the windows. The Victorian cult of domesticity placed enormous pressure on women to find fulfillment in household management and childcare, regardless of their actual interests or talents. Women who weren't naturally suited to domestic life still had to pretend to find it satisfying, because admitting otherwise would be considered selfish and unwomanly. The idea that a woman might have aspirations beyond home and family was considered not just unusual, but potentially dangerous to social order. Motherhood was supposed to be instinctual and natural for Victorian women, but it was also supposed to be performed according to specific guidelines that often contradicted natural instincts. Mothers who were too affectionate were considered overindulgent, but mothers who were too strict were considered harsh. The balance was nearly impossible to achieve, and Victorian mothers lived with constant anxiety about whether they were raising their children properly. The Victorian emphasis on child mortality, which was unfortunately common, created additional psychological burdens for women. Mothers were expected to love their children deeply, but also to be prepared for the possibility of losing them. This led to complex emotional strategies where women tried to protect themselves from grief while still being good mothers. The high infant mortality rates meant that many Victorian women experienced repeated losses that would be considered traumatic by modern standards. The few outlets for female creativity and expression were carefully circumscribed. Women could write, but only certain types of literature. They could paint, but only in watercolors and only certain subjects. They could perform music, but only in private or for small groups and only appropriate pieces. They could engage in needlework, but it had to be practical as well as decorative. Even creative expression had to serve the broader goals of Victorian femininity. The double standards applied to men and women were so extreme that they created completely different moral universes. Behavior that was considered normal or even admirable in men was scandalous in women. Men could travel alone, conduct business, engage in politics, express opinions forcefully, and live independently, but women who attempted any of these things faced social censure and personal consequences. The Victorian legal system reinforced these double standards by treating women as perpetual minors who required male guardianship throughout their lives. Married women couldn't own property, sign contracts, or make legal decisions without their husband's permission. Single women were slightly better off legally, but still faced enormous social pressure to marry and give up even those limited rights. Education for women was designed to make them better wives and mothers rather than independent thinkers or professionals. The curriculum focused on accomplishments that would make women more attractive in the marriage market, rather than skills that would allow them to support themselves. This created a generation of women who were educated enough to be frustrated by their limitations, but not educated enough to challenge them effectively. The Victorian medical establishment contributed to women's oppression by treating normal female behavior as pathological when it didn't conform to social expectations. Women who showed signs of intelligence, independence, or sexual desire were often diagnosed with various disorders and subjected to treatments designed to make them more compliant and conventionally feminine. The concept of female hysteria was particularly damaging because it allowed society to dismiss any woman who complained about her circumstances or challenged existing arrangements as mentally ill. Women's legitimate grievances were reframed as symptoms of psychological disorders, making it nearly impossible for them to advocate for themselves or seek changes to their situations. The isolation imposed on Victorian women was both physical and intellectual. They were kept apart from public life, from serious conversation, from educational opportunities, and from each other in many ways. This isolation prevented them from organizing effectively for change and made them dependent on male relatives and authorities for information about the world beyond their immediate domestic sphere. The few women who managed to create change did so at enormous personal cost and often remained marginalized even as they achieved their goals. The early feminists, female doctors, writers, and reformers faced ridicule, ostracism, and and sometimes violence for challenging Victorian expectations. Their courage was remarkable, but the price they paid demonstrates just how rigid and unforgiving the Victorian system was. The Victorian era's legacy for women was complex and contradictory. It established ideals of feminine behavior that persisted well into the 20th century, but it also created the conditions that eventually led to women's rights movements. The very extremeness of Victorian restrictions may have contributed to their eventual downfall by making the need for change so obvious that it could no longer be ignored. Looking back at Victorian women's lives from our modern perspective, it's difficult to understand how such an elaborate system of oppression was maintained for so long. But it's important to remember that most Victorian women knew no other way of life and were taught from birth that these restrictions were natural, proper, and necessary for social order. Challenging the system required not just courage, but the ability to imagine alternatives that seemed impossible within the Victorian worldview. The psychological damage inflicted by Victorian expectations on women is impossible to calculate, but it must have been enormous. Generations of women lived lives of quiet desperation, unfulfilled potential, and constant anxiety about meeting impossible standards. The human cost of Victorian propriety was paid primarily by women who had little choice but to accept their circumstances and make the best of them. Yet despite all these restrictions and limitations, Victorian women found ways to survive, create meaning in their lives, and sometimes even thrive within the narrow boundaries allowed to them. They developed complex networks of female friendship and support, found creative ways to express themselves within acceptable limits, and gradually began to push against the boundaries that confined them. The story of Victorian women's etiquette is ultimately a story about the resilience of the human spirit and the impossibility of completely suppressing human nature through social rules, no matter how elaborate or strictly enforced. It's also a reminder of how far we've come and how important it is to protect the freedoms that earlier generations of women fought so hard to achieve. And there you have it, life as a Victorian woman, where existing as a human being was essentially a full-time job that paid nothing, offered no advancement opportunities, and came with a dress code that could literally kill you. Makes you grateful for modern life, doesn't it? At least now, when society tries to tell women what to do, we can tell society exactly where it can put its unsolicited opinions. Victorian women didn't even have that luxury. They had to smile politely and pretend they enjoyed their beautiful, suffocating, ridiculous prison of propriety.